Today, we're going to talk about an actual endgame build that almost everyone forgets about, or in many cases, they actually think is not really capable of endgame. And that is the Bladesin Assassin, who is more than viable ever since the 2.4 patch made some major improvements for them. Prior to that, they were good enough, but now they keep up with builds such as the multi-shot Amazon and the Wind Druid, which can do full clears quite easily and quickly in the right hands with the right equipment. Now, how the Bladesin plays these days is quite a bit different than it used to be, since in previous versions the focus of the Bladesin was in using Blade Fury as a dangerous, relatively decent damage physical Inferno style skill, and for that use it was effective, but with 2.4 you may be able to tell from the footage on screen right now that this is not how this build is playing these days, instead focusing more on the overlooked boosts to the other two supporting blade skills that just weren't there before. The major changes basically gave us a lot more to work with in these skills, since the first skill we get, Blade Sentinel, is now going to be a standard cast against everything except bosses, since they increase the percent it gets from your weapon by a little over double, increasing its travel speed as well, and introduce the synergies for the cast damage. This results in the assassin being able to essentially have multiple traveling whirlwinds that rival endgame Amazon damage values, relatively easily. Similarly, Blade Shield at the bottom here got a number of boosts as well, ranging from increased duration and again the synergies, but also an increase in taking 3/4 of the weapon's damage if you're using a one-hander. This basically means we can actually use it to decent impact against certain troublesome enemies like Act bosses, as well as any enemies that swarm us, though I do prefer it with an indestructible weapon since, unlike the other blade skills, this will eat up your durability. All that said, the main skill people were focusing on when 2.4 released earlier this year was Blade Fury, which did get some decent bumps as well, again synergies of course, but also finally got an attack rating boost as well, as just being indirectly affected by one of the most important changes: chance to cast skills not interrupting ongoing actions if they have a cooldown, and this impacts, you guessed it, Blade Fury, which made the use of Phoenix Shield actually viable and the most damaging option, whereas previously it was hindered by the constant Firestorm interrupts that actually made it only second best. Now, we still use Blade Fury, but it is no longer the cornerstone skill of the build. Instead, it is somewhat limited to bosses, which you actually want to hug while using Blade Shield to deliver multiple instances of both your damage and gear effects to shred them relatively quickly, since Blade Fury with Blade Shield comes out to a little over 5 fairly decent damage hits per second, all of which can deliver most of your gear effects, which is the reason I actually rate this on par with the multi-shot Amazon when played properly, since it sacrifices a small amount of clear speed for a decent gain on boss speed, and it's just all around just solid. That said, the bosses are not the only thing you'll fight in this game. In fact, they're what you'll generally fight the least when farming, so we do want other tools to take up that slack. So we pick up one other trap: Death Sentry, which I maxed here for radius, though if you simply want more corpse explosions, you could go with low points in the rest into Fire Blast. But due to Blade Sentinel being our new main attack for crowds, we generally will cycle through traps faster than we burn out the limited shots on a low level Death Sentry just in general. This is because those Blade Sentinels, they're traps too. Beyond that, it's a matter of picking up your useful 1-point wonders. In the Shadow Tree, this means Fade, since for most fighting we'd rather have it up than Burst of Speed, since Blade Sentinel has a 1-second cooldown, and we usually only have 1 or 2 Death Sentries out, and those are our only frequently used skills that benefit from attack speed. You can also get some decent use from Cloak of Shadows and Mind Blast depending on your personal preferences. I'm personally more a Cloak of Shadows person since I absolutely hate any and all conversion effects, since all they do is ruin the pacing of my runs by making specific enemies untouchable for a while. But your mileage will vary, especially if you're doing your initial playthrough and lack solid equipment, since converting does make it easier to run past things, which is important for solo self-found. You can also pick up Venom as well, though this generally means sacrificing some points from Death Sentry and Fade and even our martial arts tree to grab the extra points, even if going all the way to 99, since if you use Venom, you want it at max points as well, otherwise it's just going to be kind of underwhelming. Though speaking of the martial arts tree, I do pick up the optional Dragonflight for some movement tech, since we won't be using Enigma on this build, though you could get a teleport charged amulet or circlet if you were lucky with rares, since both those slots are a little little more flexible whenever we get into the gear selection. Generally, in the background footage, you won't see me using many of the above, since I like showing off how the skills work on enemies rather than how we can avoid the fighting in general. Though back on the subject of the solo self-found stuff, this build is not super conducive to it sadly, but it is doable, more so with the changes in patch 2.4 thankfully. It just requires a bit more knowledge of your gear and how the skills work, so basically I would say going through with a Trapsin or a Dragon Tail Assassin is overall quite a bit easier if you don't mind burning your skill resets when you want to shift over to this. But if you are determined to go through with the Bladesin, life is definitely easier than it used to be at least. In normal, for those wanting to go with pure Bladesins, you will get your 1-point wonders along the way like Fade, Dragonflight, and your support Shadow skill, but you'll mostly invest in Blade Sentinel for clearing out the trash mobs. It is now a fairly solid skill and can work most of your way through normal as long as you keep your weapon choice on point, or simply put, the biggest chonking one-handed damage weapon you can find since you lack a lot of the support abilities. For bosses, you can use skills like Blade Fury to deliver bleeding if you choose to have something like Malice equipped, but it's not entirely necessary if you have some patience, since while bosses are not terribly hard on this build, it's going to be pretty much the same struggle you have with any normal weapon-based build against them. And Nightmare is when you want to start getting your Death Sentry up and running as well, since it will greatly improve your clear speed. With our usual mixed trap strategy of 3 or 4 of our main trap, in this case Blade Sentinel, with 1 to 2 Death Sentries for popping corpses. Be careful not to over-invest in Death Sentry just yet, since you still want points in all your blade skills due to your synergies. But you do want to get a decent radius with whatever plus skills you have, and again, just keep going after the biggest one-handed weapon you can find, and focus the rest of your gear on survivability. But hold on to any plus damage jewels you may be finding, since they will be handy later on for off-weapon boosts while waiting for endgame gear. As you get into Hell, effects like Crushing Blow and Bleed for Blade Shield and Blade Fury will start becoming fairly important against bosses, so if you can find a source of this, awesome. If not, things will be a little slower. And again, just stick with the strongest one-handed weapon you can find. You should even consider some mid to high rune words here, depending on your luck, but for solo self-found, I can't really recommend any that are super common, other than the usual Crescent, Black, and maybe an Oath at a stretch, but the rune cost for that one is reaching the outer edges of single-player solo self-found feasibility. Now, a little less sticky is going to be what we choose for chase gear, though again, like with the multi-shot Amazon video, I need to press home the fact that this is chase gear, not GG gear. So this stuff you can eventually farm for even in single player, not stuff like packing a half dozen perfect Vermilion Jewels of Fervor into perfect Jeweler's armor and diadems with the exact suffix we want, although that's more of a multi-shot Amazon setup. This is because I want these guides to be useful for the average player, even if it sacrifices some clickbait. Now, this gear is still not exceptionally easy to find, since a lot of it is fairly high-end stuff, but overall it is comparable to what similar performing physical builds cost, with some stuff like Gore Riders, for example, being a staple that is across multiple builds. Not to mention they can be upgraded should you want to go Blade and Dragon Tail together instead of Blade and Death Sentry. This is further helped along by the fact that we use several pieces that overlap with that build, such as Phoenix Shield, which gives us a fairly nice % damage effect that can cap out at 400%, and also gives us a handy redemption aura to keep us topped off between battles, since after your Death Sentry uses a few corpses, there will still be a handful on the ground to act as a, well, rejuvenation potion. The other really common overlap is the Fortitude armor. Again, big % damage boost, other good mods, and useful across quite a few builds thanks to a number of the perks, and it actually works quite well with a teleport amulet or circlet if you get one, and theoretically the game could generate a rare circlet that would easily be best in slot for this build, but I've yet to see it personally. This is because they can get sockets plus skills, enhanced damage % as well as teleport suffixes, among other things, but yeah, we don't work in theoreticals here. That's why we choose G-Face for our helmet with enhanced damage jewels, just because it's a good one. That is one of the old helmets I used on a certain mercenary, and since we don't need attack speed, it's good there as well, and it's also got a good source of crushing blow, in addition to that extra damage we put in it. If you go kicks with this build, you might consider something with increased attack speed instead though, but it's still a solid helmet for that too. On the amulet, I mostly just have Atmas here for the pocket amplify damage, though with testing, the amulet is actually really flexible. Plus skills help damage a little, could pick up some resist here if you wanted, or could go with a safety amulet to grab block if you feel you really need it, especially for hardcore. That said, earlier, if you need teleport, this is probably where you want to get it. On the rings, you do not absolutely need Raven Frost. I just use it so I don't get chilled because that impacts my movement speed and trap laying speed. Like I said, it's not an absolute necessity, especially if you prefer Fury over Sentinel, but in testing I found it makes runs a lot more fluid than using plus skills rings like Bulkathos, even though that does add more damage. The other ring is a dual leech ring, mostly for our boss fights or when we get swarmed. We don't get a lot of use out of it since our recovery is mostly from corpses outside of boss fights, but I find it handy enough to beat out a plus skills ring as well, though I would say the resist and attack rating are also pretty dang important to that factor. On the belt, I have Arachnid's Mesh for extra plus skills across the board. It helps here and there. If you feel like you need more damage reduction, you could go with String of Ears for that leech, you could go extra damage with Razor Tail, or you could go Lightning Absorb with Thunder God's Vigor for those tougher areas in Acts 4 and 5. This is another flexible slot like the amulet where you can kind of fit it to your personal needs, such as attack speed if you go kicks or durability if you don't. Second to last, we have gloves, again sticking with damage, Steel Rend in this case, which since our normal attacks don't really care about attack speed on this build, it's easy to get this extra damage kicking along. The only thing to consider changing this for is if you are going for different hybrids than say Death Sentry here, since speed will only really impact you for those, and you could go faster cast or faster attack speed on your gloves instead. Though one of the most important parts of the Bladesin is, and I've tried to press this throughout the video, your choice of weapon. We want a lot of damage because that directly translates into more damage for our skills, and we want it to be one-handed so we don't get the massive two-handed penalty. So I went with my Ethereal Death Berserker Axe. Yes, an Ethereal Death Eden would be better, I just don't have one of those because the Berserker is useful for more builds. Either one provides high damage, crushing blow, deadly strike, bonus to attack rating, a pinch of mana leech, all of which are super useful, especially when stacked with the percents from the rest of our gear. As far as our charms, I am using the Physical Sunder on this character as it helps smooth things out, though I do tend to need to use Blade Fury to take down the immunes in a timely fashion, since it will trigger more stuff necessary for them. In regard to plus skills against plus maximum damage charms, this is another it depends situation. The safe bet, though, is plus damage charms through just normal play, so you kind of want to weigh the pros and cons, but both work great. On that subject though, it is worth noting that you cannot trust your character screen in regards to the damage on these skills, unfortunately, since all three of the blade skills are notoriously messed up in that regard. In general, you will usually be doing much more damage than is listed per hit because of how the enhanced damage effects kind of stack onto things. As far as the mercenary, the two big choices are Pride, which boosts your damage even more and does well against a number of enemies, and Reaper's Toll, which usually smooths out the gameplay quite a bit since it has a much better chance of triggering than Atma's. And even though it's only Decrepify, the reliability really does help out a lot more than Pride for the feel of playing this build, even though the speed difference is relatively minor. This is because most of our attacks are relatively short range, and the mercenary has a chance to proc this, unlike on the multi-shot Amazon. Now, there was a poll yesterday asking whether you thought the Bladesin could keep up with the multi-shot Amazon. As I guessed, the answer no won by a landslide. The reality is, across the test runs, the Bladesin was generally extremely close to the Amazon in clear times, but the Freezing Arrow multi-shot Amazon we covered in the video on screen now did end up beating her on 5 of the 7 build runs I did for each in overall time, with the Assassin usually winning on boss kill speed as well as the test areas in Acts 1 and 2, including cows, while the Amazon dominated the areas in Acts 3, 4, and most of 5, mostly due to attack patterns and enemy durability.